Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. We're going to start out and talk about budgets and really at a high level, and then narrow down to grant budgets, which is very exciting because we all like to get money. So I'm going to share my screen. And you all should see first an Excel document, but I know Excel is super exciting, so we're going to save that for a little bit here. And now you should see the slideshow. So grant budgeting, what we want to, our objectives today. We want to talk about your agency or your organizational budget, which is a continuation of a last coffee cup conversation, kind of where we ended up. We're going to talk about budgeting by function or area of admin, fundraising, and program, and then budgeting by funder. And then Laura's going to take us on a trip through grant budgets when you're submitting with your grant application, and some do's and don'ts and some tips there. So diving right in, some tips about your overall budget. First, you should have one. And some organizations say, oh, well, we do the same thing every year. We don't need a budget. You really always need a budget. That way it can align with your strategic plan. When people are suggesting you do fun, new, exciting things, you can talk about the cost and how it's not in the budget, or modifying the budget, but just having a budget. That's the best tip of all. Use your existing chart of accounts. We see a lot of budgets that are created by committees or people that don't work within their accounting system. And it's really hard to put that into the accounting system if you created it in Excel or on a napkin, and it doesn't align with the chart of accounts that you have. And we talked about that at the last coffee cup conversation. Using historical data from your accounting system so that you don't have to recreate things from scratch. And I'll show you the Excel here in a minute when I talk about using tabs and spreadsheets and documenting assumptions about coming up with your budget. We talked last coffee cup about starting with your expenses first and then figuring out how you're going to pay for them. And very important, as I was putting together this presentation and creating a spreadsheet, there can be mistakes in Excel. Whether you're really great at Excel or you really need a lot of help, you need somebody to have a proofreader and an Excel reviewer. So I'm going to pop over, and can everyone see this? Please shout out if the screen, it may be small for everyone, but does that look good? It's like a fun spreadsheet here, right? First, we're going to start. You can see at the bottom, I have a lot of tabs here, and this is a sample Excel document that we will share. You could utilize this, but it's really best to export your chart of accounts and maybe some historical information into a spreadsheet and then build your agency budget from your chart of accounts, not trying to take someone else's budget template and forcing it into your chart of accounts. And we can help you with that if you have any questions. So the first thing you need to do is make sure your chart of accounts really reflects what you want it to, and break it down and get your overall agency budget. And you can see that this revenue, expense, direct program expense, facility, office, and fundraising, and big kind of bucket items that maybe you could condense into maybe one line item for fundraising for presentation or one line item for office. The key here is there are different tabs that I have put together that feed these numbers. And one thing I want to point out in an overall agency budget, for most organizations, personnel costs are your highest expense. So you need to take a little quality time and break this down. And I do have a tab here of personnel costs, where in 2022, who am I going to pay? How much am I going to pay? What are the taxes associated with that? I mean, the full cost of your personnel. Insurance costs, 401k. So this is basically where I start to feed into and link to this overall agency budget. And you can play with this. You can do several. You could copy and paste in here. You could do lots of different scenarios, but you really need to think through this largest expense, because it's really a driver of most all of your expenses. So I say spend a lot of time here, and it's usually your largest expenditure. So for this overall agency budget, we're just utilizing this section of the spreadsheet right here. And it feeds here. You can see I have a formula that pulls that number from the other page. So if I go and change something over here, it will directly change it in the overall agency budget. So when you're doing the overall agency budget, just remember, it's not something you're going to knock out in an hour or alone. And you're going to have to spend some quality times with assumptions and other tabs. I put the gremlins there because you know gremlins can get into your Excel spreadsheet and ruin all the formulas. Okay, the next section is budget by function. So you got your overall agency budget. You're like, I'm done. But you're really not done. The next level is to break it down by area: administrative, fundraising, and program. So be prepared. So why I say be prepared is you can't just pop over to that spreadsheet and just start jumping in and dumping numbers into, well, I think that's admin, and let me just put that one in fundraising. You really have to think about where your expenses land and how do I come up with that document? You know, how do I allocate things? Do I do it by units or percentage, or do I by where people work, or how many square feet I have? I mean, you're trying to figure out like what's your true administrative cost or what's your true program cost. We work a lot with organizations just to help them figure out which bucket their expenses go to. And you can apply an allocation for each line item of your expenses. And I'll show you that with this Excel spreadsheet. Using additional tabs and linking data, it gives you a roadmap to why did you do what you did? Why did you put all the executive director's salary under fundraising? You need to have some documentation so people can follow and adjust if necessary. Be knowledgeable. You don't know what you don't know. This is maybe something new, or you're like, this is accounting, or this is really hard for me to comprehend. It's okay to work with your accountants, read up on it. There's a lot of YouTube things out there. I put in some of the resources. There's a whole BKD webinar that we put a link to about how to allocate your expenses by the 3 areas. I know it's really exciting to like go home at night and watch a YouTube video about functional expenses. So be prepared. You've got the zombie apocalypse emergency kit here. So utilizing like a spreadsheet like this, I have my overall agency budget, then I can copy it to the next tab. And here's the overall agency budget in this column. Now I'm going to go through the exercise of allocating it into 3 different areas. Revenue and allocation, that's probably not as intense or meaningful as getting your expenses first. what it truly costs to do something. So I'm going to focus on expenses very quickly, and then we'll come back to the revenue. So personnel, the salary I have here in 3 different buckets, and you're like, where do those numbers come from? I can't just take everybody's salary and apply a percentage to it overall, right? I have to look at Christy's salary and Jenny's salary and Michael's salary and figure out what areas they work in and what percentage goes in each bucket. So I go back over to a tab and I do a percentage based on time study. So there's a lot of different ways that you can look at this. Time study. We keep timesheets, so it's super easy for us to look at our time and know where we work. It still is a level of difficulty, but I can look and see that maybe the executive director is spending 50% of the time in program, 40% in an admin, and 10% in fundraising. Then I have to go to each line item here and allocate that to know how to budget within each area. So I take the $80,000 of the executive director's salary times 50%, and the $40,000 is the program part of that person's salary. And as you can see, each area has a different allocation percentage because they're doing different things. If I get down to the staff, many times, not all time, they are 100% in a program. So you can see that I have to go through all this exercise for the salaries, taxes, insurance, and 401k just to figure out what to pull over to my budget by area. It's like I say, sometimes you can't just roll in one day and say, I'm gonna spend 30 minutes doing my functional allocation. You have to put some thought behind it. So a lot of recommendation is block out time for yourself. Don't think you're gonna get it done all in one sitting. Enlist help, get feedback from different areas, get an Excel expert, those type of things to make sure that you have all the tools you need to pull and put these in the right place. Laura will be speaking a little bit later about some of the particulars about how to do some allocations to maximize also when you're asking for grant dollars. And we can spend all day in this tab and go through, but what I will say is once you establish a percentage to allocate, you can probably apply that percentage to other items that aren't clearly in a bucket. Like I know that your direct program services, usually we're not going to spread those the same way we've spread salary, because when you travel for your program, that's 100% program. We understand that. Technology. You might have a system that just supports your program, and that's 100% program. But rents, well, everybody in the office is using it differently. So I'm going to use my salary percentages overall and allocate this way. So I have a different tab where I put the things that I'm like, oh, I have to spread those things over different areas and come up with the percentages. And I use the percentages I came up with my personnel cost. If you go through an audit, a financial statement audit, they ask a question about where you came up with this allocation method. So you're supposed to come up with the method, document the method, and make sure it's reasonable. So that's really part of what they do with an audit, is make sure that this allocation is reasonable. We also use this allocation for your 990. You have to put that on your 990. And so you don't want to cheat yourself out of budgeting by an area that a lot of people may put rent all under administrative, but it's not really administrative. Your program people are using rent. So the true cost of your program is not just $22,000. It includes $30,000 worth of rent. So if you only get $100,000 to cover program costs, it doesn't truly cover all your costs. So more to come when we talk about grant budgets. And this is kind of my segue to Laura's more detailed, is you've budgeted overall, and now you've budgeted by function. Now, what's going to pay for each of those areas that you just broke out? So I know this is a little bit like looking at a crystal ball, because you don't know exactly who's going to fund you. You might have a good idea based on past. You may have new funding sources or a capital campaign, but you just got to give it your best shot. You may have to revise that. And what does that tell us? When we're budgeting for next year, that's going to tell us if I have 3 grants and I know what they typically cover, this exercise is going to also tell me what is not covered by funders and what I have to raise myself, or if our fees for service is going to cover our expenses. So it really tells you if you can deliver all those expenses that you've laid out realistically. It also tells you, do we need some alternatives? Like if we don't get funded by X funder, are we going to have to cut a program or a salary? Or if we get funded by a funder, do we add positions? So this does tell you if you need to add or subtract from your budgeted expenses. It also serves as a risk assessment of your funders. Do you have a concentration of funders that you rely on, that if they weren't there, that it signals a serious issue that you would have to pivot quickly? It also will tell you if there's an overlap of funding versus a gap of funding. So for example, you may get 3 different funders that want to fund your staff or a program, but nobody wants to fund the executive director. Well, you can't 300% allocate funders to one salary. So this will also give you an exercise of what you need to ask funding for. So here is how I turn this budget by these 3 different areas, and then added 3 more. It could be a lot more, but of this overall program, admin, and fundraising, who funds it, right? So let's go down to the expense again, and let's talk about personnel. I know that Kaufman's going to fund me. Typically, if I get the same amount as last year, they're going to say they will pay for $79,000 worth of program, not admin. Or then they're going to pay for $15,000. They're going to pay for that technology. And they're going to pay for $6,000 of office expenses. And that's how I come up with the $100,000. Health Forward, oh, they're going to pay for salaries again. But, okay, these are my 2 funders. What am I going to have to come up with myself? And I think this column is so important, because you may be funded by Kaufman or Health Forward or anyone for $100,000, but maybe it only funds that same person, and you're going to be lacking over here with the unrestricted funds. And it makes more sense if you're like, well, I've got 79,000, 44,000. I've got to come up with this here that isn't related to any restriction, or I'm going to have to get a funder to come pay. Look, nobody's paying for rent, but me, raising unrestricted funds. So this gets complicated, but again, something you can ask for assistance with to think through, because this is telling you what you need to raise money for. If Kaufman funding didn't come through, what would be your plan B? And to have really honest, transparent discussions with leadership, with your board, and with potential funders who are maybe reluctant to fund something in the administrative side, or if your fundraising is really doing its job and covering what your grants don't. So that's the quick and dirty spreadsheet that I put together to give you an example of the way you can start out with an overall budget and move into some smaller subsections, and then continuing that into and really diving into the detail. So with that, I'm going to flip back over to the PowerPoint and hopefully pass the baton to Laura, and she can utilize and segue from what we just talked about to particular grant budgets for funders.
Yes, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? My goal with this presentation is to speak both to organizations that have never written a single grant, but also ideally to give some tips and tricks to organizations that write a lot of grants and have had successful fundraising from foundation funders. And we think about the term budget outside of the nonprofit world as a total. What's your budget for buying a car? What's your budget for taking a trip, for example? A grant budget is not the lump sum. That is the ask amount. The grant budget has to tell the funder what you are requesting specifically, item by item. And one of the things that I've discovered is that there are certain foundation funders that may not look at any portion of your application other than the budget. So it has to be good, and it has to tell the complete picture of what you're asking for. Ideally, your application explains your request both in numbers through the budget and in words through your narrative. But the fact is, reviewers are strapped for time, and they may go directly to your budget and try to figure out what you're asking for from there. So a good budget is going to be able to show the reviewer which person on your staff is going to spend the most time on your particular project or program. And as Christy showed in her percentage breakdown of those personnel costs, this budget will tell them that. Where will the project or program take place? This should be on your budget if you're paying rent or receiving an in-kind donation of space. So you really want your budget to answer who is performing the tasks, what is being asked for, and what programs you're going to provide, as well as where you're going to be doing the program or project. And just as an aside, those few wonderful funders that fund general operations, this does not apply to those applications, because for those you can submit your general overall agency budget. But many funders do not fund general operations. So you have to be prepared to create a specific project or program budget. And one of the most useful tips I can give is, before you start your project or program, create the budget for it. Do not go backwards just when you're asking for funding for a particular funder and try to come up with that project budget from scratch, working backwards. That is difficult to do. Again, in the application, if the funder provides their own budget template, I highly recommend that you use their budget template. You want to make things easier for the funder not more difficult. They're going to be comparing your application to a number of others. And if they have to switch around between formats, they might get confused. They may not get the correct information. So if they give you a budget template, by all means use it, even if it takes more time to reconfigure the way you have your budget laid out into their form. And we talked about general operations versus program or project funding. Read the directions. Funders are, foundation funders especially, are notorious for not funding specific things. And these things are all over the map. Some funders will not fund salaries, which seems very counterintuitive if they want to support a charity, but they don't want to pay the people that are doing the work. However, no point in asking for something that they specifically say they will not fund. Some are very strict about not funding scholarships or fundraising or special events or sponsorships or anything having to do with lobbying or legislative work. Some funders will fund travel under specific circumstances. For example, if your organization is traveling around the city to provide services, that might be an allowable expense, while providing funding for a staff member to travel to a national training would not be covered, for example. So just read the instructions. If you have questions about whether something is allowable or not, always reach out to the funder. That is what they are there for. They want to receive qualified applicants. So reach out and get clarification on that. And a big picture question before you apply for any grant: how complicated is the application? How much time is it going to take for you and other people to do the work of the letter of intent, the application itself, the reporting, the measurement of data, the evaluation? If this is a $2,000 grant and it's going to take a lot of people a lot of time, you need to think about, is it worth it? Can my hours and my staff and my funding be better spent on a different grant? But you also want to think about, maybe this funder will fund you year after year. Then in that case, it is worth that initial investment to spend quite a bit of time on that first grant, hoping it will be repeated. Or can you use the work that you did on this application, such as your project budget or other pieces of your narrative, transfer to other funders' applications? And usually at least some of it can. And now we want to switch to the revenues side of the grant. And everybody understands why funders want to see your expense side of the spreadsheet. But why do they want to see the revenues? Funders want to invest and fund projects and programs that bring other resources to the table. I hear a lot about partnerships. That's on every grant application. Who are you partnering with? And the partnerships can be financial in terms of other funders, or also in-kind gifts. They can be gifts of knowledge, gifts of reduced rent. Any of those kinds of things show that the community respects the program and your organization, and you're going to be sustainable because you have a wide range of support. And if you can show the funder that you've already secured some of your funding, that gives your project credibility. Hey, I'm not the only one that's going to be backing this. It has other support. Other people feel like this is a worthwhile cause. And so I've listed kind of the other categories you can use in terms of breaking down revenues. You don't have to list every funder by name. You can group those together under foundation funding. If you intend to ask a foundation for funding, you can list that. It's pending. There's nothing wrong with listing those foundations you intend to ask for funding from. The more, the better from your reviewing funder's perspective. And I want to say just a little bit about in-kind revenues. We all know about in-kind donations that can be physical objects, but revenues coming in-kind can also be expertise. Let's say a professional is giving you services below the market rate or pro bono for free. So those can be listed as a revenue as well. Your volunteers, they're working. You don't have to pay them. This is an in-kind source of revenue that needs to go on both sides of the budget. So you want to put the market rate in for what you would have to pay someone, but you're getting a volunteer to do it for free. And Christy did a really good job of breaking down the personnel costs. We're going to shift to expenses here. And this just kind of breaks down what she already covered for those personnel costs. You really need to demonstrate to the funder, even if it's not specifically asked, why each person that you're asking to fund with this grant is important to the project or the program. Attach job descriptions, attach their resumes if the application allows you to do that. I find that a table like this is really helpful, even within your narrative, if the format allows that. And say, well, what does the administrative clerical support person possibly add to this project or program? Well, we couldn't very well run a program if we didn't have somebody answering the phone or replying to emails. So even as basic as that, the more detail you have the opportunity to give about why each person's role is integral to the project or program helps make your case to the funder. And as I mentioned before, the in-kind items, say it's donated space or space rented to you below market value. You would need to include the full fair market value for the rental of that space in your expenses, showing a corresponding donation line on the revenue section. Does your staff have to train volunteers? Volunteers have a cost. Do you have to include extra insurance if you are inviting volunteers onto your site? Does your staff take time to train your volunteers? Do you produce a training manual or other materials for your volunteers? Do you provide them food or gifts or other perks such as free admission to your events or something like that? Those need to be added in the cost under in-kind. Another question that has been coming up recently is, how are you going to pay to evaluate your program? When it comes time, you've received a grant, that's great. When it comes time to report on it, you're going to have to talk about how you evaluate this grant. And a lot of funders are now asking that in the grant application itself. If you're going to pay for an outside evaluator, or if a member of your own staff is going to have time spent evaluating your program, that's a cost. It's often left out of grant budgets, but it is an important cost of a program or a project. And now I'm just going to take a few minutes and talk about how you can make sure you're using best practices to make sure you are handing in the absolute best budget that you can for grant funding. You want to make sure that your budget and narrative match. I know I said before, sometimes they only read the budget and sometimes they might only read the narrative, but I have definitely had funders come back and who have clearly read both and say, hey, the narrative says one thing, the budget says another. Which is it? To double check, read through your narrative with a copy of your budget handy. Every time you read something in your narrative that costs money, stop and make sure it's in your budget. And that includes personnel and job descriptions as well. If you mention a staff person, make sure that staff person is in the budget. And the same thing goes for your timeline. A lot of applications request a timeline of what you're going to do and when you're going to do it. Anything that you put in that timeline needs to be budgeted for as well as accounted for in the narrative. I have had clients, not naming any names, that wait until the last minute to do these grant budgets, and then they don't have any idea of what things cost. You don't want to pull numbers out of the air. You do not want to make up budget numbers. It is fine to estimate, but you need to do some research and then keep track of where you did that research, where you got the information, so you can explain how that number was reached if you are asked. For example, a funder may come back after receiving an application and say, hey, it looks like you put $1,000 a month for telephone. Where are you getting that number? Why is it so expensive? And if you have quotes from vendors, prices from online ads, or comparable expenses from a similar agency, all of that backup stuff is going to help you if there are questions. And this is especially relevant to those more complex grants that are going to require maybe one interview, maybe a site visit, maybe 2 interviews and a site visit. They're going to have questions on how you arrived at these numbers, so be prepared to show the backup materials. And right now, the prices for everything are higher than they were. In the past, if you've maybe added 5% to your budget, if it's a recurring program or you're using an agency budget for general operating expenses, look at your costs very closely this year because all the supplies are more expensive. And you also want to look at the timing of the grant. Let's say it's a 12-month grant and you are scheduled to have staff reviews and potentially offer some raises, ideally, in that time. So you want to budget for that in your personnel costs as well, depending on the timing of the grant. So you're not short when it comes time to pay those increased salaries. Funders are going to check your math. Even if you're using Excel or Google Sheets, which I do recommend, check the numbers with a calculator. Have someone on your board go over it. If you have an accountant that is a supporter of your organization or a volunteer, have them double check to make sure that everything is adding up correctly. You don't want your application kicked out because the columns don't add up. And your budget's going to change. These are estimates at best. Even if you've done your research, something is probably going to change. If you submit a grant application and something changes so that your budget is affected, I would say between 10 to 20%, either direction, let the funder know, especially if the award decision hasn't been made yet. They realize that if you're applying in January, you may not even have done your budget for the upcoming fiscal year yet, but just communicate, and funders understand that there are changes and they would rather hear about it from you before they hand over the money. One question I get a lot as a grant writer is, well, how much should I ask for? Should I ask for the maximum amount? Should I ask for the minimum amount? If you don't have a good idea of what this funder's range for funding typically is, you can look up their 990s and see how much they've given to other similar organizations. If you're just starting from scratch with this organization, call the foundation. That's what they're there for. Ask, what should a first-time applicant ask for? What amount is reasonable? You don't want your application thrown out initially because you've asked for $100,000 from a foundation whose maximum grant is $5,000. You want to make sure that it's a reasonable amount. And then finally, just a couple of short notes about formatting. Again, if they provide a budget template, use it. Use Excel or Google Sheets. Try not to use a handwritten Word document. It just doesn't look like you've put the effort in to know how your budget is going to be. Use at least 12-point type, teeny tiny budgets. If they can't read it, how hard do you want them to have to work to see your budget? You don't. If you're using your own template because they don't provide one, I think it's helpful to use some contrasting, highlighting colors to separate the expense and revenue categories to really make those easier to read. Don't use cents, decimal places in your dollar amounts, even if your electric bill is $72.49, round up. It's distracting to have decimal points on there, and we're looking at big picture, so we don't need the pennies. And finally, one mistake I see a lot is clients will give me a budget where things aren't calculated on the same time frame. For example, they pay their insurance annually, so they've given me an annual cost for their insurance, but they pay their rent monthly, so I'm given a monthly cost for their rent. Everything needs to be consistent as far as the time period in which it's being paid, so there's no confusion about that on the budget. And then the next slide, just kind of a silly, if grant applications actually said what they meant, please pull apart and reassemble all of your program budgets and financial reporting data from scratch to fit our uniquely whimsical, quirky template, which is found in our glitchy online portal. If you've applied for grants before using funders' budget templates, I'm sure you've experienced some of these things. And I want to emphasize that even if I don't write grants for your organization, if you are an SKC client and you have questions, please feel free to reach out to your accountant or your team member, and they can ask me, and maybe it's something that I can help you with. And that's it.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Laura and Christy. At this point, are there any questions that anybody has? There were a few that have come into the chat. One was SKC services are technically below market rate. Should organizations capture this discount as in kind, or is it different since the discount is offered to all of their customers?
That is a great question. And Laura and I were just talking about that today. It is below market, and I don't believe it matters that it's offered to everyone. What we can help you with is quantifying that. That is something internally that we're working on too, because what is market rate, and calculating the difference between what you're paying and the value that you're getting at a fair market value. So that is something that we can assist with. We have some internal numbers, and on the in-kind, I will say on services and things that are in kind, it is very much up to an organization on the accounting side, really, that you determine what that fair market value is to you as well. So the donor can tell you like pretty much anything, right? I gave you something and it's worth $10,000, but you really know that you could have gone and purchased it at $5,000. And so you have to make that final call about a reasonable fair market value that you're recording, right? So we might tell you that you get $10,000 worth of services, but when you do your comparisons, you might say, well, no, it's really 7,000, or, oh, it's actually 12,000. I've done my due diligence, and if I went somewhere else, I would have to pay 12,000 more. What you're really trying to communicate in these budgets is, if I had to pay for it out of my pocket at fair market value, and I did my due diligence, what would I have to pay for it? So we get below market rent. I went out and I looked at comparable comparable commercial properties and did a calculation. It aligned with what the landlord was telling me, but I didn't just take that one, feedback from the landlord. I hope that helps. So we're always happy to walk through some in-kind and fair market value calculations with you.
Are there any other questions? Well, seeing and hearing none, I thank everybody for joining us today. There are going to be 2 quick, easy questions that will flash up on the screen in order for you to provide feedback for today's session. Our next session is on Thursday, October 28th at 2 p.m. and the topic is going to be tracking and managing cash flow projections. I hope that you or someone from your organization will be able to join us. If you have ideas for future coffee cup topics that you think would be helpful, please enter those into the chat. We're always looking for what will be most useful to those that we serve. Let us know if you have any additional feedback, and please take a moment to answer those 2 questions. Thank you so much for joining us today, and have a wonderful rest of your Thursday.